They got their name from their early missions, cruising the seas to scout out enemy fleets or swooping down to attack enemy merchantmen, lines of communication, and other warships. But it wasn't long before the cruiser came into its own as a swift and heavily armed warship. While still employed on solitary surveillance and raiding missions, it began to take on a larger role, both on the front lines of battle and as an escort vessel for larger types of warships. By the beginning of the 20th century, the cruiser had proven instrumental in the emergence of the United States as a world naval power. From the wood and steam of the American Civil War to the missiles and microchips of the Persian Gulf, these sleek vessels have had a longer history and undergone a greater design evolution than any other type of actively serving warship. It is this unique adaptability that makes the cruiser such an important part of the U.S. battle fleet. Prowling the seas with the sinewy grace of a lion, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser is the embodiment of modern cruiser design. First deployed by the U.S. Navy in 1983, these vessels display the classic features of a cruiser: speed, endurance, and versatility. Weighing 9,500 tons and 563 feet long, the Ticonderogas carry a crew of almost 400 at sustained speeds of over 30 knots. Their Aegis air defense systems are the most sophisticated in the world, enabling them to control dozens of fighter planes, even as they track the movements of up to 200 separate targets at once. Armed with a devastating array of weapons ranging from rapid-fire 5-inch guns to sea-skimming Harpoon and Tomahawk missiles, they are navies unto themselves.
When I look at the cruiser, I think of it in terms of air warfare and strike warfare. Now, couple that with the later cruisers of the Ticonderoga class, the most sophisticated anti-submarine warfare system afloat today, and quite frankly, we can do just about anything. And I know that sounds like a bold statement, but the bottom line is it's true.
Although the Ticonderoga-class cruiser can, and often does, act alone, one of her primary missions is to operate in company with other warships, particularly the attack aircraft carriers that are the core of the Navy's surface fleet. Her computerized central command capability provides the brains, her weapons the muscle, and her Spy-1 radar the eyes of a powerful, well-coordinated battle group. However, the cruiser has not always occupied such a vital place in the world's fleets. In fact, when the word cruiser was first coined, it was used more to describe a mission than a specific type of ship.
The cruiser itself was a ship that, in my own view, should never have existed. It was a ship that emerged from a number of ship types. It was virtually kicked out of the battle line as being too weak to stand up in a pounding match, and so by default took up these duties such as commerce raiding, reconnaissance, scouting, and so on and so forth, and was loosely termed a cruiser by the French and loosely termed a frigate by the other navies.
Swift and well-armed frigates became one of the most widely used warships of the 18th century. In battle, they were used to support the great ships of the line by relaying signals from the flagship to other vessels and by towing damaged ships out of harm's way. They sometimes fought in small packs on their own, trading shots with other groups of frigates. But they were best known for their independence and their ability to cover large stretches of ocean, which made them ideal for scouting and for hunting enemy merchantmen. It was their reconnaissance ability that earned them the nickname, the Eyes of the Fleet.
The cruiser was the scout. The cruiser was the reconnaissance unit. Went out and sought out the enemy line of battle and came running back saying, they're over here, they're over here. Its function was not to fight them. It might be used as a lure to try and get the enemy to go in a particular direction, but it was never intended to fight with the battleships per se in a line of battle.
It wasn't long before vessels which cruised alone on such surveillance and raiding missions were simply called cruisers, adopting the name the French had coined earlier. During the American Civil War, the term was used informally to describe the fast Confederate vessels used to raid Union shipping and the equally swift ships built by the North to chase them. But the name cruiser still referred primarily to the kind of job the ships did, rather than to any definitive design characteristics.
I think cruisers can be categorized as medium-strength warships of sufficient armament to fight anything of their own category and outweigh anything smaller, and usually with a turn of speed that will let them escape from anything bigger.
By the second half of the 19th century, steam power began to replace sails, and naval leaders began to recognize the advantages of ships that would be both faster and better equipped to withstand enemy fire than earlier cruisers. Among the first officially designated cruisers was the Wampanoag class, built by the U.S. Navy between 1867 and 1868. These vessels measured 335 feet in length and were powered by sails and steam boilers that could push them to a top speed of over 17 knots, making them the fastest warships of the time. But their wooden hulls lacked the strength to withstand the vibration of the engines, and the Wampanoags were ultimately considered a failure by American naval leaders. At the same time, a British designer named Sir Edward Reed was creating a new type of cruiser. Understanding the inherent weakness of wooden hulls, he decided to build his vessel out of iron. Sir Edward's vessel, the Inconstant, was an excellent warship, but it still had problems.
The problems that beset it were not exactly that beset the Wampanoags. They were more in the nature of very high initial cost and very high maintenance cost, plus the engineering plant was not as strong as it should have been. Had the engineering plant been very strong in the Inconstant, then it would have almost been the ideal cruiser.
Despite its drawbacks, the Inconstant charted the way for future cruiser development.
The last half of the 19th century was a time of technological turmoil amongst the world's navies. Iron was replacing wood for hull construction and was soon replaced by steel. Muzzle-loading guns were being replaced by breech-loading guns, and they were getting rifled bores, and the projectiles were changing from round shot to shells we're more familiar with today. Power was going from sail to reciprocating steam engines and ultimately to turbine steam engines, and from coal-fired power to oil-fired power by the early 20th century.
As the cruisers steamed into the 20th century, gaining speed, endurance, and firepower, it served a variety of needs, from providing a naval presence in distant waters during peacetime to taking a place in the battle line in times of war. Yet despite the many roles the cruiser would fill, none would have a more lasting impact than its earliest and most daring incarnation as a rampaging commerce raider. And no raider would be more notorious or feared by its enemies than the Confederate cruiser Alabama. When the American Civil War began in 1861, the Union imposed a naval blockade against the industry-poor Confederacy, a blockade which sought to strangle the Southern war effort by choking off the flow of supplies that kept the rebellion alive. With little naval strength of their own to defeat the Union blockade, Southern leaders decided to strike instead at the unprotected Northern merchant ships that plied the trade routes of the world. To achieve this goal, they turned to a group of fast, sturdy vessels, which historians would later refer to as the Confederate cruisers. And none would be more effective or more audacious than the Alabama. Constructed in an English shipyard to avoid the Union blockade, the Alabama was an impressive sight. Her 220-foot frame carried 8 heavy guns, ranging in size from those firing 32-pound shells to massive 100-pounders. Like all cruisers, the Alabama was built for speed. Her 300 horsepower steam engine could push her through the water at 13.5 knots. But she was also equipped with sails that would enable her to cruise unrefueled for months at a time. The vessel's perfect symmetry prompted Captain Raphael Semmes, who assumed command of the Alabama in 1862, to describe her as having the lightness and grace of a swan. But this swan was also a deadly predator. Over the next 2 years, the Alabama roamed more than 75,000 miles over the oceans of the world, capturing or sinking more than 60 Union merchant ships. She spread such fear that the mere mention of her name was enough to paralyze commerce. But the Union Navy was hunting the hunter. In 1864, the northern cruiser Kearsarge finally cornered the Alabama off Cherbourg, France. Although the two ships were similar in size and weaponry, the Kearsarge had fresher gunpowder aboard and was in better repair than her Confederate adversary. Her enterprising captain, John Winslow, had also provided his ship with a makeshift armor belt by having his crew drape anchor chains over the vessel's sides and engines. During the hour-long battle between the two ships, Semmes watched repeated volleys from his guns glance off the chains on the Kearsarge, leaving it unscathed. Finally, dismasted and shot to pieces, but her flag still flying defiantly, the Alabama slipped beneath the waters of the English Channel.
Remember, Alabama never saw a Confederate port. I mean, she was built in England. She was ultimately crewed in the Azores and went on from there and died in France. So she never saw her homeland.
The lessons learned from the Alabama's fiery career blazed a path for the future development of the cruiser. The speed and endurance of the Confederate vessel, along with the armored protection of her Union adversary, would inspire the designers of future commerce-raiding cruisers. One of the most famous of these was the German cruiser Graf Spee. Commissioned in January 1936, she displaced 12,000 tons, making her the largest cruiser built up to that time. The Graf Spee's immense weight was due to her impressive arsenal of weapons, which ranged from torpedoes to 6 11-inch guns that could hurl 670-pound shells a distance of 17 miles. This lethal firepower prompted some to refer to the Graf Spee and her two sister ships as pocket battleships. But the Graf Spee was every bit a cruiser. With her relatively thin 4-inch side armor and state-of-the-art diesel engines, she could reach a speed of 26 knots, well beyond that of all but the fastest British and French battleships. She also carried her own catapult-launched scout plane to help her locate victims. Shortly after war was declared in September 1939, the Graf Spee was assigned the classic raider mission of sinking enemy merchant vessels and disrupting trade. She was an immediate success, sinking 9 vessels over a 3-month period, and more importantly, spreading panic among the crews of Allied merchant ships.
Her general method was to launch an aircraft, scout the area, find a merchantman, come up upon them, order them to not radio, then open fire and sink them, and then put the prisoners and the survivors aboard one of her mother ships that would come into the area.
Faced with a serious disruption of their shipping routes, the British deployed 23 powerful warships to hunt down the notorious raider. The Graf Spee eluded her pursuers until December 13th, when she was spotted off the South American coast by 3 smaller British cruisers, Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles. Although the British vessels were faster than the Graf Spee, their 6- and 8-inch guns were no match for the Germans' 11-inch firepower. So the British commander, Commodore Henry Harwood, wisely split his force and attacked the Graf Spee from both sides, making it impossible for her to concentrate all her fire in a single direction. Though the British ships took a terrible pounding, they inflicted enough damage to force the wounded German vessel to flee to the nearby neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay. As the battered British cruisers waited outside the harbor, a high-level battle of wits began. The British Admiralty sent out phony radio messages indicating that a powerful force of larger British warships had arrived to reinforce their trio of cruisers. The ruse worked. The Graf Speye's captain, Hans Langsdorff, was convinced that he was trapped by an overwhelming enemy squadron. Knowing that international law would force him to leave Montevideo within 72 hours, Langsdorff chose to save his crew and blow up his own ship, rather than sailing into the jaws of what he believed would be certain destruction. When he later found out that he had been tricked, the disgraced German officer committed suicide.
Today, she remains as a monument to believing false intelligence. That's what it really boils down to. She was tricked into death.
The Graf Spee was one of the most famed of the cruising raiders, but she was also one of the last. With improvements in long-distance radio communication and aerial scouting, it was becoming too difficult for a lone cruiser to evade destruction by disappearing into the vastness of the sea, as it had been able to do in previous centuries. Yet long before the Graf Spee was even built, the leaders of the world's navies were already thrusting the cruiser into a new role as an integral part of the battle fleet, and it was largely due to the writings of an obscure American naval strategist. Just minutes before midnight on the morning of May 1st, 1898, American Commodore George Dewey's fleet slipped quietly into the calm waters of Manila Bay. Just a week earlier, the United States Congress had declared war on Spain, which had ruled the Philippine Islands for 300 years. Dewey had prepared well. Intelligence from local spies had been collected, and his crews were well drilled and ready. Most important of all, Dewey commanded an imposing fleet from a powerful new cruiser. She was the Olympia, the flagship of the Pacific Squadron and the pride of the still young American Navy. The Olympia's bold entrance into Manila Bay marked an important turning point for the cruiser. No longer just a lone commerce raider preying on enemy trade ships, she was now an integrated member of an attack force, poised to lead her nation into war. The groundwork for this new role for the cruiser had been laid several years prior in the writings of an American naval officer named Alfred Thayer Mahan. While Mahan had served in the Norse blockade fleet during the Civil War and commanded ships in both the Atlantic and Pacific, he had never fought in battle. But he did suggest the formation of the Naval War College and later served as its president.
Alfred Thayer Mahan was the father of modern American naval thought. He taught at the Naval War College from its beginning in the 1880s, and by 1890 was beginning to collate his lectures and put them in book form, and come forth with the most famous book, Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which basically said if a nation is going to be great, it has to be a sea power.
Mahan theorized that wars were won by nations that commanded the sea, and that such control could be secured not by disrupting trade, but by destroying an enemy's fleet. Only large fleets of powerful warships, acting in concert on vast, watery battlefields, would have the ability to achieve these victories. Mahan's theories prompted naval leaders throughout the world to look at their existing fleets in a new light. In the United States, it raised the level of debate between those who advocated traditional scouting and raiding functions for cruisers and those who were anxious to throw them into the set-piece battles described by Mahan. The advocates of Mahan's theories won the battle of ideas, and only 8 years after Mahan published his famous book, The Olympia was leading a squadron of 4 cruisers and 2 gunboats on a mission to crush the Spanish fleet anchored in Manila Bay. The sturdy but elegant vessel was well suited to the task. Weighing 5,870 tons and packing 4 8-inch guns mounted in twin turrets, the Olympia was protected by armor plates 2 to 5 inches thick, which were believed to be strong enough to withstand enemy fire from guns her own size, but light enough to allow swift and decisive movement at sea. And the Olympia was fast. Originally conceived for commerce raiding, her 2 powerful steam engines could move her at a speed of 21.7 knots. The Spanish defenses at Manila were formidable, at least on paper, consisting of 7 warships backed up by 37 gun emplacements on shore. Confident of the abilities of the 8-inch guns and protective armor of his cruisers, Dewey steamed smoothly into the bay. 40 minutes later, as the American squadron came within range of the still anchored Spanish ships, he issued his famous order to the Olympia's captain: "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." Captain Charles Gridley was ready. Since graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy, he had waited 34 years to command a major ship in battle. Though dying of cancer, he had refused to be relieved, and now he gave the order for the Olympia's guns to open fire. Though they were shooting at stationary targets, the results were less than ideal.
Of the 4,000 rounds fired by the Navy at the time, only 2% hit. And it pointed out the need for improved gunnery and eventually culminated in the creation of a centralized fire control system for warships.
Nevertheless, before the morning was over, the old ships of the Spanish Pacific Fleet were all either sunk or smoldering, and Dewey calmly ordered that breakfast be served to his men. The Battle of Manila Bay was over. Not a single American ship had been lost. The only casualty was Captain Charles Gridley, who died of his cancer before he could be sent home to the United States. The Battle of Manila Bay was the decisive, indeed the only, naval battle of the Spanish-American War in the Pacific. It was also a watershed for the cruiser, which in the course of one eventful morning had helped to transform the United States into a world naval power. The cruiser's success at Manila Bay secured a place for it in the world's main battle fleets, as military leaders planned for what they believed would be the great naval clashes of the 20th century. Just 18 years later, the cruiser would play a key supporting role in one of the largest naval conflicts of all time, the Battle of Jutland. Jutland took place in 1916, during the second year of the First World War, when the rival German and British fleets had settled into an uneasy stalemate. The clash was eagerly anticipated by both sides, each of which sought to decimate the forces of the other in a single naval encounter of the type envisioned by Alfred Mahan. So when Admiral Reinhard Scheer, the new and aggressive commander of the German High Seas Fleet, sought to lure the British fleet into the waters off the coast of Denmark, the British willingly set out to meet him. Unlike the fleet flagship Olympia of 1898, or the commerce-raiding Graf Spee of 1936, the cruisers at Jutland would play yet another role, one of the most important that Mahan had envisioned. Formed into swift squadrons, they fanned out in front and to the sides of the lumbering battleships, scouting for the enemy fleet and screening their own ships from torpedo attack by marauding groups of smaller enemy destroyers. During the huge battle, which involved over 250 ships of all kinds, the cruisers on both sides fought superbly in just those roles. Occasionally, they even met each other head-on.
There were 2 or 3 instances where cruisers met up with each other, illuminated each other with their searchlights, and shot at each other until either one or the other was destroyed.
The Battle of Jutland was a textbook example of Mahan's strategy. Both sides fully integrated battle fleets, slugging it out in a single, winner-take-all encounter. There was just one problem. The results of Jutland were anything but decisive. After being severely mauled, Scheer managed to bring most of his battered fleet home safely. Having actually sunk more ships than they lost, the Germans claimed victory. But for the remainder of the war, they would never again seek another all-out confrontation with the British fleet, thus leaving the Royal Navy in command of the seas. Jutland would in fact prove to be the last time that Alfred Mahan's idea of a single decisive naval battle would be tested by large fleets of gun-firing surface ships. Submarines and aircraft, able to attack from over the ocean and beneath it, made their first appearances shortly before Jutland and would soon lead to radical changes in the tactics of naval combat. But naval planners of the time didn't yet appreciate the huge impact these weapons would have. They concluded that still larger fleets of cruisers and battleships would be needed for the wars of the future. This belief ignited a cycle of post-war shipbuilding programs and arms control efforts, which would have an enormous effect on the development of the cruiser. On February 6, 1922, an agreement was concluded between the world's naval powers that was designed to end the hugely expensive naval arms race that had helped ignite the First World War.
At the end of World War I, Great Britain was bankrupt. She couldn't sustain a naval arms race. The United States did not want to sustain a naval arms race, particularly with Japan. And Germany was out of the picture, having been paralyzed by the Versailles Treaty. So the major nations got together in Washington in 1922 and signed the Naval Arms Treaty, which in essence provided for the scrapping of large numbers of heavy capital ships, but also enabled the construction of cruisers, heavy and light cruisers.
They were categorized as either heavy cruisers, that is, having main battery guns of 6.2 inches or larger caliber, or light cruisers of 6.1 or smaller inches.
The treaty did, however, restrict the displacement of heavy cruisers to 10,000 tons and the maximum size of their guns to 8 inches. The unexpected result of the Washington Treaty was a building boom in cruisers, scores of them being constructed worldwide over the next 20 years. The tonnage restrictions also led to important changes in cruiser design. Believing speed and hitting power were more important than protection, designers loaded as many 8-inch guns as possible onto their heavy cruisers, keeping the weight down by substituting aluminum where possible for the heavier steel. The result were the so-called treaty cruisers.
Essentially, the World War II cruisers were treaty cruisers for the most part because either early in the war we were in fact using cruisers that had been built in the 1920s and 30s, or a little bit later we were using cruisers that had been designed in the 1930s, and so the treaty still had something of an effect. I mean, both our Baltimore-class heavy cruisers and our Cleveland-class light cruisers, which formed the bulk of the cruisers built in the war, were essentially 10,000-ton cruisers.
But not everybody played by the rules. In 1931, Japan announced the construction of their Mogami-class cruisers, which they claimed weighed in at 8,500 tons. But the 4 Mogamis, which carried 15 6.1-inch guns and a 4-inch armor belt, were in fact nearly 2,000 tons over the treaty limits.
In essence, she was 12,000 tons. And interestingly enough, the particular class of ships, although built as light cruisers, were regunned as heavy cruisers just prior to the beginning of World War II.
The United States countered the Japanese ships with the Brooklyn class, which had similar gun batteries and range as the Mogamis, but were slower and carried less armor, because their designers kept them within the 10,000-ton limitation.
These cruisers also mounted 15 guns in 5 turrets. So at any one time, under rapid fire, they could smother a target.
The proliferation of cruisers and the depletion of the world's stock of battleships that resulted from the Washington and later treaties would, with the onset of World War II, thrust the cruiser into the harsh glare of battle as nothing before. But the cruiser was ready. August 1942. It had been only 8 months since the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been decimated by the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Since then, the Japanese Empire had seemed unstoppable, overrunning new territories from Burma to New Guinea. When the American Naval Command learned that the Japanese were building a base on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, they knew that this strategic threat to Australia had to be eliminated. At 6 a.m. on August 7th, the 8-inch guns of the American cruiser Quincy shattered the dawn as they opened fire on the Japanese forces holding Guadalcanal. Under her relentless barrage, U.S. Marines were able to seize the beachhead they needed to open the first Allied offensive of the Pacific War. But it didn't take long for the Japanese to respond. At 1:30 a.m. on August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, one of the Japanese Navy's most audacious commanders, stealthily maneuvered a squadron of 7 cruisers and a destroyer in among the American and Australian cruisers that were stationed near Savo Island to provide cover for the American landing forces and their transports. Mikawa's ships, specially trained for night warfare, were now in a position to crush the invasion. At 1:36 a.m., they opened fire. Within 30 minutes, the Quincy, whose salvos had opened the campaign, slid beneath the waters, where she was shortly joined by 3 other Allied cruisers. The paper-thin armor of the Allied treaty cruisers could not prevent the massive structural damage inflicted by the Japanese shells and torpedoes.
The lessons learned from Savo Island was that when you were at war, you were in battle at all times, that you never stored munitions on deck, that you were ready any moment to fight, and that you could never take anything for granted because you didn't know when the enemy might appear. And also pointed out a need, and this was probably the most important thing, is that most of the cruiser actions that were yet to be fought were going to be fought at night because naval battles were rarely fought during the day because of air cover. And so the Americans had to learn night fighting tactics.
The Battle of Savo Island was a staggering defeat for the U.S. Navy. But the Japanese failed to destroy the American landing force on Guadalcanal. In the coming months, the Allies and their cruisers would come charging back to help turn the tide. Dusk, October 11th. The heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City, the light cruisers Boise and Helena, and 5 destroyers were patrolling off Cape Esperance, watching for the appearance of the Tokyo Express with another load of supplies for the Japanese still holding out on Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Norman Scott was aboard the San Francisco, and like every man in Task Force 64, was burning to avenge the dead sailors of Savo Island. He would not have long to wait. Steaming down toward Task Force 64 were 3 Japanese cruisers and 2 destroyers, a bombardment group under the command of Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, Vice Admiral Mikawa's cruiser commander. They did not believe that the Americans were out on the water that night. As they steamed on into the darkness, Vice Admiral Goto, assuming this to be a routine mission, was preparing for bed.
The Japanese force approached, and at about 30,000 yards, one of the light cruisers, the Helena, which had a brand new surface search radar, reported that there were enemy ships. Both the Boise and the Helena opened fire with their rapid-fire weapons. Within moments, there were hundreds of shells flying toward the Japanese.
Lacking radar themselves, the Japanese were totally surprised. Shells slammed into the Japanese ships, sinking the destroyer Fubuki and setting the cruiser Aoba on fire. The cruiser Furataka was crippled and sinking, and Rear Admiral Goto lay dying on her deck.
My own father was involved in this attack aboard the Boise, and he still talks to this day about the arcs of fire that were coming out from the Boise and the Helena as they opened up with their weapons, literally pumping out the shells. And if you think about 8 to 10 men crowded in a small turret, working feverishly in 140-degree heat to hand load these shells and throw them out the rate they were doing, minute after minute, they fired for 27 minutes solid, throwing out no less than 8 to 10 shells per minute, per barrel, and 15 barrels per ship.
Savo Island had been avenged, and the tide had turned in the Pacific. Although the Allied cruisers were to endure further sacrifices in the battle for the Solomons, the determination and strength displayed by these vessels and their valiant crews would ultimately help to win those islands for the Allies. The cruiser, which had served in various incarnations as a raider, as part of the battle fleet, and as an escort ship, was ready for its next incarnation, to encompass all 3 missions, to become one sleek, technically advanced, and powerful fighting machine. The years following the Second World War would see a near halt to cruiser construction. But in the early 1950s, as a growing rivalry between the Communist East and the capitalist West, known as the Cold War, increased worldwide tensions, a new weapon was developed that would lead to a resurgence of the cruiser: the guided missile. Although first used with limited success during the Second World War, within a decade the guided missile evolved into a reliable weapon that was more accurate and devastating to enemy aircraft than the most deadly anti-aircraft guns. Always on the vanguard of change, the cruiser was enlisted as a floating platform for these and other advanced weapon systems.
At the end of the war, there were literally dozens of American cruisers available, both light and heavy. Some were sold off to foreign navies. Others were used as experimental test beds.
The new missile role for the cruiser began in 1955, when naval designers replaced some of the guns on the cruiser Boston with guided missiles. Then in 1961, the United States commissioned the cruiser Long Beach, the first vessel designed from the keel up to carry guided missiles. Measuring 721 feet from stem to stern and displacing 17,500 tons, the Long Beach was considerably larger than the biggest World War II cruisers. Her nuclear-powered engines, the first ever used in a surface warship, could help her achieve speeds of over 31 knots.
The Long Beach was originally designed as a completely all-missile nuclear warship. She was designed to fight high-capability, high-speed aircraft and other missile warships.
The startling advances embodied by the Long Beach would be eclipsed 20 years later with the emergence of a new generation of cruisers in the 1980s, the Aegis cruisers of the Ticonderoga class.
It became increasingly evident that should we ever have a war with the Soviet Union, our first thing we'd have to deal with would be a swarm attack of missiles and aircraft against our carrier battle groups. Electronically, one or more ships would have to handle the incoming hordes of weapons and destroy them before they could destroy our carriers. Something revolutionary had to be developed, and some sort of a platform to carry it had to be developed. What emerged was a marriage of a cruiser-type vessel, the Ticonderoga, and the Aegis missile defense system, an electronic defense system that can control literally hundreds of targets and hundreds of weapons.
Named for the shield of Zeus, the mythological king of the Greek gods, the Aegis radar system employs a series of roaming electronic beams which radiate from octagon-shaped antennas fixed to the ship's superstructure. The information collected by these antennae is then processed by sophisticated computers and displayed on video monitors in the ship's Combat Information Center, providing the crew with an unparalleled, three-dimensional picture of more than 200 miles of sea and air surrounding the vessel.
I believe the Aegis weapon system is going to be around for a long time because of its flexibility. What the Aegis weapon system is based on is software, and that allows us to go in and change system capabilities and system performance by improving and changing the software that drives the systems on board.
No less formidable than its surveillance ability is the Ticonderoga's weapons battery, which ranges from surface-to-air missiles and 5-inch guns designed to meet hostile air and surface challenges, to the rocket-launched torpedoes intended for enemy submarines. Its complex sonar listening devices and 2 submarine hunting helicopters further enhance its ability to mount attacks on targets below the surface. And armed with an array of vertically launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, the Ticonderogas boast an unsurpassed offensive capacity, with the ability to demolish targets more than 1,000 miles away.
When you look at a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, you say, where's our weaponry? It's all down below. It's out of sight. Just a bunch of little trapdoors, and the decks open up, and out these things come. And they can ripple fire these in amazing sequence.
The ship is maximized in all 3 dimensions of naval warfare. And I would say that some of the older cruisers, while they were extremely capable in shore bombardment, surface warfare, and had a reasonable air defense capability, they simply do not have the power and the versatility that we are able to exercise in all 3 dimensions.
With their power and technical sophistication, the Ticonderoga-class cruisers represent the final convergence of the cruiser's many roles in a single ship.
What I see is a tremendous capability that's flexible enough to go somewhere and project power or defend other interests that we may have, and yet come back and join with the battle group and assume a much larger role. So it's not a one-dimensional capability that we have anywhere. Anywhere one of these ships goes, you are taking with you a full package, both offensively and defensively.
These unparalleled capabilities have convinced many that the cruiser will continue to be a vital part of the U.S. Navy for years to come.
Our power is going to lie in the ability to process information quickly and translate that information into action and communicate it over tremendous areas of battle space. And I think that that's where the cruiser is going in the future. And for that reason, I believe we're going to see them around for a long time.
In the Ticonderogas, the cruiser has fulfilled its ultimate destiny, becoming perhaps the most versatile type of warship ever conceived.